Black billionaire girl's seat stolen by white passenger. Seconds later, flight gets grounded. "Excuse me, you're in my seat," Aaliyah Thompson said firmly, holding out her first-class boarding pass. The white businessman didn't even look up from his phone. "No, little girl," he muttered, waving dismissively. "You must be confused. This is my seat." Gasps echoed across the cabin as Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. What happened next would ground a flight before it ever left the runway, expose ugly prejudice at 30,000 HNFT, and prove that sometimes the person you underestimate has more power than you could ever imagine. This 11-year-old girl was about to teach an entire airplane a lesson about respect, dignity, and the dangerous assumption that appearances tell you everything about someone's worth. Welcome to Black Empowerment Channel. Every story we share is more than just drama. It's a reminder of strength, resilience, and justice. If you believe in celebrating Black excellence and standing against injustice and prejudice, hit that like and subscribe button right now. We would like to know where you are watching from, and what time is it for you right now in the comments. 11-year-old Aaliyah Thompson walked down the jet bridge toward Flight 457 with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. At 3'6", with natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun, she moved with a grace that came from years of attending charity galas, business meetings, and international conferences alongside her father. Her simple but expensive outfit and elegant orange gown spoke of understated wealth. Though most people wouldn't recognize the designer labels or the custom jewelry that had been gifts from world leaders and tech moguls. This was her 15th time flying first class this year alone, traveling between her boarding school in England, her father's offices in Chicago, and their family homes in Miami and London. Flying first class wasn't a luxury for Aaliyah. It was simply Friday. Her father, Marcus Thompson, had built a technology empire worth over $12 billion, making him one of the wealthiest Black men in the world. But to look at Aaliyah, most people just saw a little Black girl. And unfortunately, that was exactly how the man in seat 2A saw her. She approached row 2 and immediately noticed the problem. A middle-aged white businessman had spread himself across her window seat like he owned the entire aircraft. His expensive suit was wrinkled from travel, his graying hair disheveled, and his general demeanor suggested the kind of entitlement that came from years of assuming the world would bend to his will. He was typing aggressively on his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting in someone else's assigned seat. "Excuse me?" Aaliyah said politely, her voice carrying the refined accent that came from years of international education. "I believe you're sitting in my seat." She held out her boarding pass, clearly showing seat 2A first class, printed with her name, Miss A. Thompson. The ticket was pristine, expensive, and undeniably legitimate. Any reasonable person would have looked at it, apologized for the mistake, and immediately moved to their correct seat. But this man wasn't reasonable. He glanced up from his phone with the kind of irritated expression reserved for interruptions by people he considered beneath his notice. His eyes took in Aaliyah's appearance, young, Black, female, and his brain apparently categorized her as someone who couldn't possibly belong in first class. Without even looking at her boarding pass, he waved her away dismissively. "No, little girl," he said, with the condescending tone of someone speaking to a child who had wandered away from her parents. "You must be confused. This is my seat. Economy is that way." He pointed toward the back of the plane with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been challenged in his life. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Several passengers in nearby seats looked up from their magazines and laptops, sensing that something uncomfortable was unfolding. A well-dressed woman across the aisle frowned deeply. A businessman in the row behind them pulled out his phone, already sensing that this interaction was heading somewhere worth documenting. Aaliyah felt the familiar sting of assumption-based discrimination, but she had learned long ago not to let her emotions control her response. Growing up as the daughter of one of the world's most successful entrepreneurs meant she had faced this kind of prejudice before. People looked at her and saw what they expected to see, not who she actually was. "Sir," she said calmly, her voice remaining perfectly polite despite the insult. "I'm not confused. This is seat 2A, and this is my boarding pass for seat 2A. You're sitting in my assigned seat." She held the boarding pass closer to him, but he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he laughed. Actually laughed as if the idea of a black girl having a legitimate first-class ticket was the funniest thing he'd heard all day. "Listen, sweetheart," he said with mock patience. "I don't know how you got confused, but children don't just wander into first class. Your parents are probably looking for you back in economy. Why don't you run along and find them before you get in trouble?" The condescension dripped from every word. He had not only refused to look at her ticket, but he had assumed she was traveling with parents, assumed she couldn't afford first class, and assumed she was too young and too black to belong in his proximity. Each assumption was wrong, but his prejudice had blinded him to any possibility that he might be mistaken. Other passengers were now openly staring. The woman across the aisle looked appalled. A young couple in the front row had stopped their conversation to watch the unfolding drama. An elderly businessman was shaking his head in disgust, clearly recognizing the racial undertones of the interaction. Aaliyah remained standing in the aisle, her boarding pass still extended, her composure unshaken. She had learned from her father that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the most powerful one. True power came from calm certainty, from knowing your worth, regardless of whether others recognized it. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to please look at my boarding pass and move to your correct seat," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that suggested this politeness was a choice, not a weakness. The businessman finally looked up from his phone with genuine annoyance, as if this black girl was ruining his entire day by having the audacity to claim a seat he had decided belonged to him. His face twisted into an expression of exasperation, mixed with what could only be described as racial resentment. "Look, kid," he said loudly enough for half the cabin to hear, "I don't know what game you're playing, but I've been flying first class longer than you've been alive. This is my seat. I paid for this seat, and I'm not moving for some confused little girl who wandered away from mommy and daddy." The racist implications of his words hit the cabin like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. The woman across the aisle muttered, "Oh my God," under her breath. The businessman with the phone was now openly recording, recognizing that he was witnessing a moment of naked prejudice that would likely go viral within hours. But what the racist passenger didn't know, what he couldn't have known based on his ignorant assumptions, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had chosen to discriminate against the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world. He had decided to humiliate a girl who had access to resources and influence that could destroy his career with a single phone call. Aaliyah Thompson was not just any 11-year-old girl. She was the heir to a business empire, the daughter of a man who owned airlines, hotels, and technology companies across 6 continents. She was someone who had dined with presidents and prime ministers, someone who spoke 4 languages and had been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the most influential girls in the world. And she was about to remind this racist businessman that appearances could be very, very deceiving. The flight attendant finally appeared, drawn by the commotion and the growing circle of passengers craning their necks to see what was happening. But instead of immediately checking the boarding passes and resolving the obvious seating dispute, she looked at the well-dressed white businessman and then at the black girl, and her own biases began to show. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. But her tone and body language suggested she had already decided who she believed belonged in first class and who didn't. If you're enjoying this story about standing up to discrimination, and you want to see how this powerful girl handles this racist situation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Have you ever witnessed someone being discriminated against because of their race or age? What would you have done in this situation? Let me know in the comments below. The flight attendant's arrival should have been the moment when justice prevailed and common sense restored order to the cabin. A simple check of boarding passes would have immediately revealed that Aaliyah was in the right and the businessman was in the wrong. But instead of approaching the situation with professional neutrality, the flight attendant's own unconscious biases began to influence her judgment. She was a woman in her 40s with 20 years of experience in airline customer service. And unfortunately, those 20 years had taught her to make quick judgments about passengers based on appearance, age, and race. Looking at the well-dressed businessman in the expensive suit, she saw authority and legitimacy. Looking at Aaliyah, she saw a girl who probably didn't belong in first class. "Ma'am," the flight attendant said to Aaliyah, with the kind of patronizing patience reserved for difficult children. "Can I see your boarding pass?" The request itself wasn't unreasonable, but the tone and the fact that she had asked only Aaliyah for documentation while ignoring the businessman's complete lack of proof revealed where her assumptions lay. Aaliyah handed over her boarding pass without comment, watching as the flight attendant examined it with unnecessary scrutiny, as if she expected to find evidence of fraud or forgery. The boarding pass was legitimate, expensive, and clearly showed Aaliyah's assignment to seat 2A. But instead of immediately asking the businessman to move, the flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of confronting a well-dressed white man on behalf of a black girl. "This does show seat 2A," the flight attendant admitted reluctantly, "but there seems to be some confusion." "Sir," she turned to the businessman with a much more deferential tone, "could I possibly see your boarding pass as well?" The businessman looked up with the irritated expression of someone whose authority had been questioned by people he considered his inferiors. "I don't need to show you anything," he said dismissively. "I've been sitting in first class for years. This little girl is obviously in the wrong section." His refusal to produce his boarding pass should have been a red flag, but the flight attendant seemed more concerned with avoiding conflict with the aggressive white passenger than with enforcing airline policy or protecting the black girl who was clearly being discriminated against. "Well," the flight attendant said weakly, "perhaps we could find Miss Thompson another seat in first class. I'm sure we can work something out that makes everyone comfortable." The suggestion was outrageous. Aaliyah had paid for a specific seat, had a boarding pass proving her right to that seat, and was being asked to compromise because a racist stranger had decided she didn't belong there. It was exactly the kind of institutional bias that her father had spent his entire career fighting against in boardrooms and business deals around the world. But before Aaliyah could respond, the businessman escalated the situation with words that revealed the true depth of his prejudice. "You should go find your economy seat," he said with a smirk that made his racist intent unmistakable. "Maybe back near the bathrooms where you belong. I'm sure your parents are wondering where their little girl wandered off to." The words hit the cabin like a bomb. Several passengers gasped audibly. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. The businessman recording on his phone zoomed in, recognizing that he was capturing a moment of pure, unfiltered racism that would likely become evidence in a civil rights lawsuit. The comment about the bathrooms was particularly vicious, playing into historical stereotypes about where black people belonged on transportation. Some passengers chuckled under their breath, whether from nervousness or agreement was unclear, but their laughter only added to the hostile environment being created around an 11-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong except exist while black in first class. Aaliyah felt the familiar fire of righteous anger building in her chest, but she had learned from her father's example how to channel that anger into something more powerful than emotion. Marcus Thompson had taught her that the most effective response to discrimination wasn't fury. It was icy calm combined with devastating action. "Sir," she said, her voice remaining perfectly controlled despite the racial abuse she was enduring. "I paid for this seat with my own money. I belong here more than you do since you apparently don't even have a boarding pass to prove you belong anywhere on this aircraft." Her words were precise and cutting, delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made several passengers sit up and take notice. This wasn't just a confused girl. This was someone who spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. But the businessman was too deep in his racist assumptions to recognize the warning signs. Instead of backing down, he doubled down on his discrimination, making comments that would soon be broadcast to millions of people around the world. "You don't even look like you could afford a ticket here," he said loudly, his voice carrying throughout the first-class cabin. "What did you do? Steal someone's boarding pass? Or maybe Daddy's company is flying you somewhere for charity?" The racist implications were now impossible to ignore. He had suggested that a black girl couldn't legitimately afford first class, that she might be a thief, and that any wealth in her family must come from charity rather than achievement. Each word dug his grave deeper, but his prejudice had blinded him to the magnitude of his mistake. Other passengers were now actively choosing sides. The woman across the aisle looked furious. An elderly black businessman in row 3 was shaking his head with recognition. He had clearly faced similar discrimination himself. A young white couple was whispering to each other, the woman looking appalled while the man seemed unsure how to react. The flight attendant, faced with an increasingly ugly situation, made the worst possible choice. Instead of firmly enforcing airline policy and removing the aggressive passenger who was creating a hostile environment, she turned to Aaliyah with a warning that revealed exactly where her loyalties lay. "Miss Thompson," she said with barely concealed irritation, "I'm going to need you to lower your voice and find a solution that works for everyone, or I'll have to ask you to leave the aircraft for causing a disturbance." The threat was breathtaking in its injustice. The black girl who had been racially abused, denied her rightful seat, and subjected to public humiliation was being threatened with removal, while the white businessman who had created the entire problem faced no consequences whatsoever. Several passengers immediately recognized the bias in the flight attendant's response. The woman across the aisle stood up and said loudly, "Are you serious? She's the one causing the disturbance. He's the one who won't show his boarding pass and keeps making racist comments." But the flight attendant had made her choice. She was siding with the aggressive white businessman against the calm black girl, perpetuating exactly the kind of institutional racism that had plagued the airline industry for decades. Aaliyah looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers who were witnessing this moment of naked prejudice. Some looked supportive, others uncomfortable, and a few seemed to agree with the businessman's assessment that she didn't belong in first class. But all of them were about to learn something about the danger of making assumptions based on race and age. "Ma'am," Aaliyah said to the flight attendant with deadly calm, "I think you should be very careful about how you handle this situation." Very careful indeed. There was something in her tone, a quiet certainty that suggested consequences far beyond anything the flight attendant or the racist businessman could imagine. But they were too caught up in their own biases to recognize the warning. They had no idea that they were discriminating against someone with the power to ground their flight and their careers and expose their prejudice to the entire world. They were about to learn that sometimes the person you underestimate turns out to be exactly the wrong person to discriminate against. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. This girl is about to reveal exactly who she is, and this racist passenger's world is about to come crashing down. What do you think should happen to employees who side with racists instead of protecting passengers from discrimination? Share your thoughts in the comments. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. What had started as a simple seating dispute had escalated into a public display of racial discrimination with passengers, crew, and airline staff choosing sides based on their own biases and moral compasses. The atmosphere was electric with unspoken conflict, and everyone could sense that something significant was about to happen. The businessman, emboldened by the flight attendant's apparent support and the mixed reactions of the other passengers, decided to escalate his harassment of Aliyah even further. He had convinced himself that he was dealing with just another entitled girl who would eventually back down when faced with adult authority. His prejudice had blinded him to the quiet strength in Aliyah's voice and the dangerous calm in her demeanor. "You know what your problem is," he said, standing up from the seat that didn't belong to him and towering over Aliyah in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating display. "Your problem is that you people think you can just take whatever you want. You think you deserve things you haven't earned. Well, this is the real world, little girl. And in the real world, there are consequences for not knowing your place." The racist language was now so explicit that even passengers who had been trying to mind their own business couldn't ignore it. "You people, your place." These were the phrases of someone whose prejudice had overcome any pretense of civility. Several passengers pulled out their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. A middle-aged black woman in row 4 stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Excuse me, but what did you just say? Did you really just tell a child to know her place because of her race?" The businessman turned his attention to her with the same dismissive arrogance. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. I'm simply trying. I'm to maintain order in first class by ensuring that passengers are seated appropriately according to their circumstances." The word circumstances dripped with racial undertones that made his meaning crystal clear. He was suggesting that black passengers didn't belong in first class, regardless of their tickets, their wealth, or their right to be there. It was segregationist thinking disguised as airline policy. But Aliyah Thompson had heard enough. She had been raised by a father who had faced this exact kind of discrimination on his way to building a business empire. And she had been taught never to back down when confronted with injustice. More importantly, she had been given tools to fight back that this racist businessman couldn't even imagine. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos with laser precision, "I think you should sit down and be quiet now." There was something in her tone that made several passengers turn to look at her more carefully. This wasn't the voice of a confused girl or a powerless victim. This was the voice of someone who had been underestimated and was about to reveal exactly how big a mistake that was. The businessman laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Oh, really? And what are you going to do about it, little girl? Call your mommy. Tell the principal. This is the adult world, and adults handle things differently than children." "You're absolutely right," Aliyah replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Adults do handle things differently, and you're about to learn exactly how differently." She reached into her designer purse, a purse that cost more than most people's monthly salary, though the businessman was too blinded by prejudice to recognize luxury when he saw it, and pulled out her phone. It wasn't just any phone. It was the latest model with custom modifications that only a handful of people in the world possessed. The kind of device that came with direct access to corporate boardrooms and government offices around the globe. "I think it's time I called my father," she said calmly. The businessman laughed even harder. "Oh, please do. I'm sure Daddy will come running to rescue his precious little princess. Maybe he can explain to you how airline seating actually works." Several passengers exchanged glances, sensing that the businessman had just made a crucial error. There was something about Aliyah's confidence, something about the way she carried herself that suggested her father might not be just any concerned parent. But the businessman was too caught up in his own arrogance to recognize the warning signs. Aliyah speed-dialed a number that connected her directly to one of the most powerful offices in the global economy. As the phone rang, she looked around the cabin with a calm certainty of someone who was about to turn the tables on everyone who had underestimated her. "Hello, Daddy," she said when the call connected, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet cabin. "I'm sorry to bother you during your board meeting, but I have a situation that requires your immediate attention." The businessman was still smirking, completely unaware that he was about to face consequences beyond his worst nightmares. The flight attendant looked nervous for the first time, beginning to sense that maybe she had misjudged the situation. Other passengers leaned forward, trying to hear both sides of the conversation. "I'm on Flight 457 to Miami," Aaliyah continued, "and there's a passenger in my assigned seat who refuses to move. He's made several racist comments, called me names, and suggested that black passengers don't belong in first class. The flight attendant is supporting his position and has threatened to remove me from the aircraft for demanding my rightful seat." She paused, listening to her father's response, then looked directly at the businessman with an expression that could freeze water. "His name?" she said into the phone. "Let me ask him." She turned to the businessman with mock politeness. "Sir, could you please tell me your name? My father would like to know exactly who he's dealing with." The businessman's smirk began to falter slightly, but his arrogance was still intact. "Tell your daddy that my name is Edward Cartwright, and I've been flying first class since before you were born. Maybe he can teach his daughter some manners while he's at it." Aaliyah repeated the name into the phone, then listened as her father's voice became audible to passengers sitting nearby. What they heard made several of them gasp in recognition and fear. "Edward Cartwright," the voice from the phone said with icy authority. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. You have just made the biggest mistake of your life." The businessman's face began to change as he recognized something dangerous in the voice coming from the girl's phone. This wasn't just an angry parent. This was something else entirely. "My daughter is Aaliyah Thompson," the voice continued, "and I am Marcus Thompson, CEO of Thompson Global Enterprises. You may recognize my companies: Thompson Airways, Thompson International Hotels, Thompson Technology, and about 40 other businesses that employ over 200,000 people worldwide." The name hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Marcus Thompson was one of the most famous entrepreneurs in the world, a billionaire whose business empire spanned multiple industries and continents. His face had been on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential people of the year. His daughter wasn't just any girl. She was the heir to one of the largest privately held companies in the world. Edward Cartwright's face went from confident smirk to horrified realization in the span of 3 seconds. The color drained from his features as he understood exactly who he had been discriminating against. He had chosen to be racist toward the daughter of one of the most powerful black men in the world, and he had done it in front of dozens of witnesses with cameras. Several passengers were now openly staring at Aaliyah with recognition and awe. The businessman, who had been recording, was zooming in on Cartwright's face, capturing the moment when arrogance turned to terror. The flight attendant looked like she was about to faint as she realized she had threatened to remove the daughter of a man who probably owned more airline stock than anyone else on the planet. But Marcus Thompson wasn't finished speaking. "Mr. Cartwright," his voice continued, "now carrying the full weight of billionaire authority, you insulted my daughter, discriminated against her based on her race, and created a hostile environment that violated both federal civil rights laws and basic human decency. What happens next is entirely up to you." The businessman tried to speak, his voice coming out as a weak croak. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't know. You were just what?" Marcus Thompson's voice cut through his stammering like a knife. "You were just being racist. You were just assuming that a black girl couldn't possibly belong in first class. You were just revealing exactly the kind of person you really are." Cartwright looked around the cabin desperately, as if hoping someone might defend him or offer him an escape route. But every face he saw reflected disgust, anger, or satisfaction at seeing justice about to be served. The passengers who had witnessed his discrimination now understood they had watched someone choose exactly the wrong target for their prejudice. The flight attendant tried to salvage the situation with damage control. Mr. Thompson, I apologize for any misunderstanding. I'm sure we can resolve this situation quickly. And there is no misunderstanding. Marcus Thompson's voice interrupted her with Arctic coldness. You sided with a racist passenger against my daughter. You threatened to remove her from an aircraft while allowing him to continue his discrimination. You failed in your most basic duty to protect passengers from harassment. Aaliyah stood calmly in the aisle, watching as the two adults who had humiliated her just minutes earlier began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Her father had taught her that true power wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and ensuring that discrimination had consequences that would prevent it from happening to others. Now, Marcus Thompson continued, his voice filling the cabin with absolute authority. Here's what's going to happen next. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next will absolutely shock you. This billionaire CEO is about to demonstrate exactly what real power looks like when someone discriminates against his daughter. Do you think people who make racist assumptions get what they deserve when they face consequences? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening as Marcus Thompson's voice continued to emanate from Aaliyah's phone with the authority of someone who controlled billions of dollars and had the power to change lives with a single decision. Every passenger was transfixed, understanding that they were witnessing a moment when prejudice met consequences in the most dramatic way possible. Mr. Cartwright, Marcus Thompson said, his voice carrying the icy precision of a man who had built an empire by making decisions quickly and executing them ruthlessly. You need to understand exactly what you've done. You didn't just insult a girl. You insulted my daughter. You didn't just make racist comments. You made them about a member of my family, and you did it all in front of witnesses who are recording every word. Edward Cartwright's transformation from arrogant businessman to terrified defendant was complete. Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his hands were visibly shaking as he realized that his casual racism had just destroyed his life in ways he couldn't even begin to calculate. Sir, Cartwright stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I sincerely apologize. I had no idea who— if I had known— If you had known what? Marcus Thompson's voice cut through his pathetic attempt at damage control like a blade. If you had known she was my daughter, would you have treated her with respect? But since you thought she was just another black girl, racism was acceptable. The question exposed the core of Cartwright's prejudice and the fundamental problem with his attempted apology. He wasn't sorry for being racist. He was sorry for being racist towards someone with the power to destroy him. His moral failure was complete and public, documented by multiple cameras for the world to see. Mr. Thompson, the flight attendant interjected desperately, I want to assure you that our airline doesn't tolerate discrimination of any kind. This was simply a misunderstanding about seating arrangements. Marcus Thompson's laugh was cold and humorless. A misunderstanding? My daughter showed you her boarding pass, proving her right to seat 2A. Mr. Cartwright refused to show his boarding pass at all. She remained calm and polite while he made racist comments, and you threatened to remove her from the aircraft while taking his side. Exactly what part of that was a misunderstanding? Why, the flight attendant had no answer, because there was no answer. Her bias had been exposed as clearly as Cartwright's racism, and now she was facing the consequences of siding with prejudice instead of protecting a passenger from discrimination. But Marcus Thompson was just getting started. His voice took on a tone that suggested he was moving from establishing facts to taking action. I'm going to put you on speakerphone now, he announced, because I want everyone in that cabin to hear what happens when someone chooses to discriminate against my family. Aaliyah touched a button on her phone. And suddenly, Marcus Thompson's voice filled the entire first-class cabin with crystal clarity. Every passenger could hear every word as one of the world's most powerful CEOs prepared to demonstrate exactly what real consequences looked like. Captain Ellis, Marcus Thompson said, and several passengers gasped as they realized he was speaking directly to the pilot. "This is Marcus Thompson. I need you to stop this aircraft immediately and return to the gate." "Mr. Thompson," the captain's voice came through the plane's communication system, clearly surprised to be receiving a direct call from such a high-profile passenger. "Sir, we're currently in the queue for takeoff. Is there an emergency?" "Yes, Captain, there is an emergency. There is a passenger in first class who has been making racist comments toward my daughter and creating a hostile environment. There is also a flight attendant who has failed to protect passengers from discrimination and has threatened to remove the victim instead of the perpetrator. I need both of them removed from this aircraft immediately." The announcement hit the cabin like a bomb. Passengers looked around at each other with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction to absolute amazement. They were witnessing something unprecedented, a flight being stopped because a billionaire's daughter had been discriminated against, and the discriminators were about to face immediate consequences. Cartwright tried one more desperate attempt to save himself. "Mr. Thompson, please. I have a family. I have a career. I made a mistake, but please don't." "Don't what?" Marcus Thompson's voice overrode his pleading with ruthless precision. "Don't hold you accountable for your racism. Don't protect my daughter from further harassment. Don't ensure that other passengers never have to face the kind of discrimination you've displayed." The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to the gate due to a passenger conduct issue. We apologize for the delay and will have you airborne as soon as possible." The plane began to slow and turn, the engines powering down as they exited the takeoff queue. Cartwright collapsed back into the seat that wasn't his, the reality of his situation finally sinking in completely. His racist assumptions had grounded an entire flight and exposed his prejudice to hundreds of people who were already posting videos to social media. "Mr. Thompson," the flight attendant made one last attempt to minimize the situation. "Perhaps we could handle this more quietly. I'm sure we can find a solution that doesn't require—" "Quietly." Marcus Thompson's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. "You want to handle racism quietly? You want to sweep discrimination under the rug? That's exactly the kind of thinking that allows this behavior to continue." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the full weight of moral authority and business power combined. "Let me be very clear about something. I didn't build a 12 billion empire so that my daughter could be treated as a second-class citizen by racist passengers and biased airline employees. I didn't become one of the most successful black entrepreneurs in history so that other people's children could face the same discrimination I faced decades ago." The cabin was completely silent except for the sound of phones recording and the occasional gasp from passengers who were understanding the full scope of what they were witnessing. "This isn't just about my daughter," Marcus Thompson continued. "This is about every black child who has been told they don't belong somewhere they have every right to be. This is about every girl who has been judged by their appearance instead of their character. This is about stopping discrimination before it spreads to other passengers and other flights." The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and passengers could see through the windows that airport security vehicles were already waiting. Word had clearly spread through the airport that something significant was happening on Flight 457, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. "Mr. Cartwright," Marcus Thompson said, his voice now carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You chose to be racist toward my daughter in front of dozens of witnesses. You assumed that a black girl couldn't belong in first class. You created a hostile environment based on your prejudices, and now you're going to face the consequences of those choices." Cartwright was crying now, tears of self-pity rather than genuine remorse, understanding that his life was about to change dramatically and permanently. His racism had been caught on camera, broadcast to the world, and he was about to be removed from an aircraft by security while millions of people watched the videos online. "Security is boarding the aircraft now," Marcus Thompson announced. "They will be removing both Mr. Cartwright and the flight attendant, who failed to protect passengers from his discrimination. After that, Flight 457 will continue to Miami, and my daughter will sit in her rightfully assigned seat with the dignity and respect that every passenger deserves. The sound of footsteps on the jet bridge announced the arrival of airport security, federal agents, and airline executives who had been summoned to deal with what was already being called the most documented case of airline discrimination in history. Aaliyah Thompson stood calmly in the aisle, watching as the adults who had humiliated her prepared to face justice. She had learned from her father that true power wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that discrimination had consequences that would prevent others from facing the same treatment. The racist businessman and the biased flight attendant were about to discover that sometimes the person you choose to discriminate against has more power than you could ever imagine. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because you need to see what happens when security boards this plane and these discriminators face the consequences of their actions. Have you ever seen someone's racism come back to destroy their life dramatically? Share your thoughts about what these people deserve in the comments below. The jet bridge echoed with the sound of multiple footsteps as a small army of officials boarded Flight 457. Airport security led the way, followed by FBI agents, airline executives, and what appeared to be legal representatives. The presence of federal agents transformed the situation from a simple airline incident into a potential criminal investigation. And every passenger in the cabin understood they were witnessing something that would make international headlines. The lead security officer, a tall man with 20 years of experience dealing with difficult passengers, approached the first-class section with the grim expression of someone who had been briefed on exactly what had transpired. Behind him, a woman in an expensive suit who was clearly a high-ranking airline executive looked like she was preparing for the crisis management challenge of her career. "Ladies and gentlemen," the security chief announced to the cabin, "I am Officer Ramirez with Miami Airport Security. We are here to address a reported incident of passenger discrimination and to ensure the safety and comfort of all travelers. We ask for your cooperation as we resolve this matter." His eyes immediately found Edward Cartwright, who was still sitting in Aaliyah's assigned seat, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in real time. The businessman's expensive suit was now wrinkled and soaked with nervous sweat, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by the desperate terror of someone facing consequences he never imagined possible. "Mr. Cartwright," Officer Ramirez said with professional authority, "I need you to gather your belongings and come with us immediately." Cartwright tried one final pathetic attempt to avoid his fate. "Officer, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I was just trying to maintain order in first class. This young lady seemed confused about her seating assignment, and I was simply—" "Sir." The FBI agent who had boarded behind security interrupted with icy professionalism. "We have multiple video recordings of your conduct, including your explicit racist statements and your refusal to show your boarding pass. There is no misunderstanding here." The agent held up his phone, which was displaying one of the many videos that passengers had recorded and immediately uploaded to social media. The footage clearly showed Cartwright's discriminatory behavior, his racist comments, and his arrogant refusal to acknowledge Aaliyah's legitimate boarding pass. Furthermore, the agent continued, "We have a complaint from Marcus Thompson alleging federal civil rights violations. Your conduct today potentially violates multiple federal statutes regarding discrimination in public accommodations." The words, "federal civil rights violations," sent a visible shiver through Cartwright's body. He was no longer just facing embarrassment or job consequences. He was potentially facing criminal charges that could result in federal prosecution, substantial fines, and even prison time. The airline executive stepped forward, her face pale with the understanding that her company was facing a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. "Mr. Cartwright, I am Lisa Harper, Senior Vice President of Customer Relations for the airline. I need you to understand that your behavior today violates every policy and value our company stands for. She turned to address the entire cabin, clearly aware that dozens of cameras were recording her every word. On behalf of our airline, I want to apologize to Miss Thompson and to every passenger who witnessed this unacceptable display of discrimination. This behavior does not represent our company values, and we will be taking immediate and comprehensive action to address it. But Cartwright wasn't finished making his situation worse. Desperate and panicking, he made one final appeal that only served to dig his grave deeper. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising with hysteria. "I've been flying first class for 20 years. I'm a platinum member. I deserve better treatment than this. I was just trying to maintain standards." The racist implications of his words, that standards meant keeping black girls out of first class, were lost on no one in the cabin. Several passengers groaned audibly at his continued display of prejudice, even in the face of law enforcement. "Mr. Cartwright," Officer Ramirez said with the patience of someone who had dealt with thousands of difficult passengers, "you need to come with us now, or you will be placed under arrest for interfering with a federal investigation." Meanwhile, the flight attendant who had sided with Cartwright's discrimination was facing her own reckoning. A second airline executive, a stern-looking man in his 50s, approached her with the expression of someone about to deliver life-changing news. "Ms. Hale," he said gravely, "I am Victor Lang, Director of Human Resources. Your conduct today represents a fundamental failure of your duties as a customer service representative and a violation of our company's anti-discrimination policies." The flight attendant, whose name was apparently Hale, tried to defend her actions with the same weak excuses that had failed her earlier. "Sir, I was just trying to maintain order and follow proper procedures. I didn't want to create the confrontation." "You didn't want to create the confrontation." Lang's voice carried the incredulity of someone who couldn't believe what he was hearing. "So, instead of checking boarding passes and enforcing airline policy, you chose to threaten the victim of discrimination while protecting the perpetrator." He held up his own phone, which was displaying the viral videos that were already spreading across social media platforms around the world. "Miss Hale, your bias is documented on video and has been viewed by millions of people in the last 30 minutes. You threatened to remove a passenger for demanding her rightfully assigned seat, while allowing a racist customer to continue his harassment." The flight attendant's face crumpled as she realized that her career was over just as definitively as Cartwright's. She had let her own unconscious biases influence her professional judgment, and now she was facing the consequences in the most public way possible. But the most dramatic moment was yet to come. As Cartwright finally stood up from Aaliyah's seat, gathering his belongings with shaking hands, Marcus Thompson's voice returned over the phone speaker with an announcement that would be remembered long after the flight landed. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice filled the cabin with absolute authority, "I want you to understand what you've witnessed today. You've seen how quickly and completely racism can be exposed when someone chooses the wrong target for their discrimination." Every passenger was listening intently, understanding that they were hearing from one of the most powerful business leaders in the world as he delivered a lesson about prejudice and consequences. "Mr. Cartwright assumed that because my daughter is young and black, she couldn't possibly belong in first class. He never considered that she might be the daughter of someone with the power to ground his flight and end his career. His prejudice blinded him to the possibility that appearances can be very deceiving." Cartwright was now being escorted down the aisle by security, his head hanging in shame as dozens of passengers recorded his walk of humiliation. The man who had felt so powerful when intimidating a girl was now being removed in handcuffs while the world watched his disgrace. "This is what happens," Marcus Thompson continued, "when discrimination meets consequences. When racism encounters real power, when people who think they can abuse others based on race discover that some of those others have the resources to fight back." The airline executives were taking notes, clearly understanding that this incident would require a complete review of their training procedures and company policies. The federal agents were coordinating with local authorities to ensure that all legal aspects of the situation were properly documented and investigated. Ms. Hale, the HR director continued, addressing the flight attendant, "You are terminated immediately. Your failure to protect a passenger from racial harassment and your threat to remove the victim instead of the perpetrator represents a fundamental violation of your employment obligations." As both Cartwright and Hale were escorted off the aircraft, the remaining passengers burst into spontaneous applause. They were applauding not just for justice served, but for a powerful reminder that discrimination has consequences when it encounters people with the courage and resources to fight back. Aaliyah Thompson finally took her rightful seat in 2A, settling into the leather chair that she had paid for and deserved from the beginning. Her composure throughout the entire ordeal had been remarkable, and passengers were looking at her with new respect and admiration. "Aaliyah," her father's voice came through the phone with obvious pride. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Daddy," she replied with a smile that showed she had never doubted the outcome. "I knew you would take care of it." "You handled yourself perfectly, Princess. You remained calm. You stood up for your rights, and you showed everyone in that cabin what real strength looks like." The captain's voice returned over the intercom with an announcement that brought the extraordinary incident to its conclusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation has been resolved. We will be departing for Miami momentarily. On behalf of the entire crew, I want to apologize for the delay and commend our passengers for their patience during this unfortunate incident." As the plane prepared for takeoff, passengers continued to process what they had witnessed. They had seen racism exposed and punished in real time. They had watched a girl demonstrate more grace under pressure than most adults could manage. And they had learned that sometimes the person you choose to discriminate against has more power than you could ever imagine. The videos of the incident were already going viral around the world, turning Cartwright and Hale into symbols of how quickly discrimination can destroy lives when it meets consequences. But more importantly, Aaliyah Thompson was becoming a symbol of dignity, strength, and the power of standing up for what's right. If this story of courage, justice, and standing up to discrimination inspired you, make sure you're subscribed for more powerful stories about people who refuse to accept injustice. Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wished you had spoken up? How can we all work together to ensure that everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and let's continue this important conversation about creating a world where respect truly is not optional.